have a good friend named David. David's a bit older than I am, and he's retired and he lives in Florida. The other thing you need to know about David is that he's a diabetic. For a number of years, David's been taking insulin as a way of regulating the sugar levels in his blood. Recently, he got himself a new device. It's an internet-enabled automatic insulin pump. He wears it on his hip. It periodically tests his blood, and he can adjust the insulin dosage either mechanically or from his mobile phone or tablet. And because the pump is connected to the network, it can also send David's blood sugar levels and other test results to his doctor, who can review those results and make adjustments without David even going into the office. The doctor doesn't have to be in the office either. He could be on the golf course and use his smartphone to change David's insulin dosage. This is truly a miracle of modern science. It increases efficiency and gives David more freedom and a better quality of life with respect to his insulin requirements. It is, in truth, a life-changing form of technology. But there are also dangers, direct and indirect. Let's talk about the direct danger first. During a hacker convention in Las Vegas known as DEF CON, two security researchers demonstrated they were able to crack the security on a standard insulin pump of exactly the sort that David is using. They demonstrated that they could actually cause the pump to give the wearer a near-fatal dose of insulin. So not only does David have a life-changing, liberating medical device on his hip, he must also come to grips with the fact that he's carrying around a personal assassination device that could be used to try and kill him. Now, when I told David about this, he had a very sensible answer. He asked, "Why would anyone want to kill me?" And he continued to wear the new insulin pump. In effect, David did a cost-benefit analysis of the direct dangers of this new technology and concluded that the near certain benefits of a better lifestyle and ease of use outweighed the very small possibility that someone might try to kill him using his insulin pump, as opposed to, say, running him down with a car. Devices like David's insulin pump are changing the nature of how data is collected about us and how we are informed about the data we've determined we need to know. Consider, for instance, the example of the German automaker Volkswagen, which the Environmental Protection Agency accused of installing a switch or defeat device in supposedly clean diesel vehicles to sense whether it was being tested for federal emission standards, and if it was, to automatically switch from polluting to complying. There are, it seems, an endless number of ways in which information is now collected. New ways that didn't exist 20 years ago. CCTV cameras, biometric scanners, facial recognition cameras. These are but a few of the newer smart devices that collectively we refer to as the Internet of Things. To take another example, Google has paid $3.2 billion for a little-known company called Nest, which describes itself as an architect of the thoughtful home. What does Nest do exactly? Well, one of its products is a home thermostat. But the Nest thermostat is considered a smart thermostat. Its program learns your habits and adjusts the thermostat accordingly. Even more significantly for our purposes, Nest's thermostats are tied to the internet. So, for example, you can tell it you're coming home and to turn on the heat in the house before you get there. The underlying idea is something like the old joke about bacon, how all food is better if you add bacon. Bacon on hamburger, bacon with eggs. In many ways, the rush toward internet connectivity in consumer products is like the bacon impulse. Everything, it seems, we think is better once it's connected to the network. You can see why that might benefit you in some instances, like the insulin pump or the Nest thermostat. But I've seen internet-enabled refrigerators and toasters too. And for the life of me, I can't figure out why they're being marketed. Do I really need to be able to program my toaster from my bed? In today's lecture, we're going to look at this proliferation of Internet of Things. Eventually, these devices will profoundly change how we manage our lives and create even greater challenges to our privacy and civil liberties. To give you a sense of this, let's go back to the Nest thermostat and ask ourselves a simple question. Why would Google pay $3.2 billion for a thermostat company? After all, Google began as a company that builds search algorithms. What does that have to do with Nest? Well, as I said, the Nest thermostat is able to learn as it goes, with the objective of helping you reduce the cost of heating and cooling in your home. That also means that Nest comes to know something about you and your family. Nest will learn, for example, that when you leave the house at 7:30 in the morning on a weekday, it should not normally expect you back until 6 o'clock that night. But it'll also know that when you leave the house at 7:30 in the morning on a Saturday, you'll be back just an hour or so. Now, multiply that by the number of people in your house, and think of all the things Nest might come to know about them. It could learn the school patterns of your children or grandchildren, when and how they or your spouse travels, or even something about a maid or a nanny who might have access to the house. More to the point, Google now knows it as well. And they, in turn, can correlate that data with, say, geolocation information from your use of a navigation app to get to work or to go on vacation. That becomes very valuable information. My friend Tim Sparpani, writing in Forbes magazine, postulates that the Internet of Things really comprises 4 distinct groups of enabled products. He calls them the Internet of Me, the Internet of Us, the Internet of It, and the Internet of Those. David's insulin pump might be part of the Internet of Me, while Nest would be part of the Internet of Us, since it gathers information about a whole family. An example of the Internet of It might be the new tire pressure sensor in my car, a smart, enabled, internet-connected device that tells me when air pressure in one of my tires is low. And, at least on its face, that sort of device collects no cognizable information about me as the driver. It's limited to an assessment of my vehicle and its safety. The privacy and civil liberties issues surrounding the Internet of Things seem to differ depending upon which type of Internet we're talking about. Let's start with thinking about the Internet of Me and Us. That is, the Internet devices that collect data on discrete and identifiable individuals. At least 3 privacy questions might be embedded in such collection systems. 1. Who owns or controls the data? 2. What are their responsibilities with respect to protecting that data? And 3. What might they be permitted to do with it? The ownership control question is generally established by contract or by statute. Under contract law, the provider of the device almost certainly will claim ownership of the data. As a result, Nest and Google generally consider that they can process the data about your thermostat more or less as they see fit. In that event, however, they also take up the responsibility of providing security of this data for you. So, how does that make you feel? Not terribly confident, I imagine. Officials at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, right across the street from the White House, were astonished to discover a few years ago that an office printer of theirs was communicating with a Chinese computer and spewing out Chinese characters. In the same way, a Columbia University study found that tens of millions of Hewlett-Packard laser printers were vulnerable to hacking. Even your cloud-based nanny cam can be hacked. Why is that? Well, the manufacturers manage the data they collect in their own best interests. And some of them might not care if, say, your tire pressure data is used or misused. It doesn't affect them. But it seems worth asking a more sophisticated question. Why haven't competitive markets produced more privacy protective products? Normally, we would expect that if, hypothetically speaking, Nest treats our data badly, then another company, call it Safe Nest, would spring up and promise us more privacy and security. Why hasn't that happened yet in the Internet of Things? The answer, as with many things, lies in the economics of the industry. Right now, Internet of Things manufacturers might not have sufficient economic incentive to build a better product. Let's see why that is. In the Internet of Things, personal data is a good, that is, an economic product that can be purchased in the private market. The sale of goods can have benefits for the buyer and seller, but the sale can also sometimes have effects on third parties who aren't part of the transaction. The Internet of Things is rife with these third-party effects. Some of them are quite good effects. When data is collected on energy consumption in my house, for example, it will benefit others on the same network, whose energy efficiency could also be enhanced, or who'll have more energy available for their own consumption. Indeed, in some ways, almost every bit of data collected in any part of cyberspace adds to the overall storehouse of knowledge, theoretically lowering the cost of action. But the collection of information also can have negative consequences. One of those goes by the name of a diversion effect. If, for example, we collect more information about health, then insurers might choose to only insure the healthy, diverting their actions into more profitable ventures and leaving gaps in the market. A price cut for one might mean price increases for others who are not as well connected or whose business is not so desirable. A second negative consequence arises from a pricing problem. We want people who manufacture or market a product to take into account all of the costs of production. But they usually account only for their own costs. How otherwise could they calculate a profit? But in the example of a data breach in the new Internet of Things market, the brunt of the cost is more likely to fall on the consumer. Right now, speaking generally, when software fails to prevent an intrusion or a service provider fails to interdict a malware attack, there's no obvious mechanism through which to hold the Internet of Things manufacturer responsible for the costs of those failures. In a perfect economic world, you would pay more for your internet-connected tire gauge, and the manufacturer would build better privacy and security into it. In an imperfect world, my tire gauge is priced lower, which makes it easier to buy. But consumers experience costs in terms of lost security and privacy. So what is the solution to this problem? For an answer, let's turn to Ronald Coase, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, and his famous article, The Problem of Social Cost. His fundamental insights, which quite deservedly go by the name of the Coase theorem, produce an understanding of how the economic reality of harmful third-party effects ought, in theory, to be linked to legal concepts of duty and liability. One of the things that Coase realized is that in a free market, the person who has the most to gain or lose will economically eventually wind up paying. So, for example, even if you make a railroad liable for fires caused in a farmer's haystacks that the rail line passes, if the rail operator's profits are great enough and the costs of spark arresters too high, the railroad will just pay for the privilege of continuing to cause fires. Its agents will negotiate with the farmers and make up his losses. Coase says we should expect the parties to negotiate, and whichever one of the two is the beneficiary of the greatest positive net economic value will be the one to actually proceed with their economic activity while compensating the other party for the foregone opportunities. But in the real world, we know, and Coase knew, that adjudicating liability or negotiating exchanges of value takes time and costs money. And we also know that information asymmetries sometimes give some actors more or better information than others. So, for example, the used car salesman knows a lot more about the quality of his product than the consumer does. And we also know that sometimes some of the actors face what we call a collective action problem. Think of all the farmers alongside the railroad. Collectively, their economic value might actually be greater than the railroads, but they have a huge problem getting together and coordinating their joint response to the railroad. Taken together, we call all of these things transaction costs. That is, the money that needs to be spent just to make a transaction happen. Sometimes they're small, but sometimes they can be huge. That is exactly what we see with respect to the collection of individual data in the Internet of Me or Us. All of the many little me's don't have the economic incentive to individually negotiate with Internet of Things providers. They accept whatever the terms of service are as a condition of getting the new product. So consumers have a collective action problem. Each individual is in a relatively weak position, especially in respect to negotiations with large manufacturers, whose products are the most essential. As consumers, we also suffer from information asymmetries. Internet of Things providers know much more about the way their product collects and uses data than do most consumers. So what is the right economic answer to this liability question in a world where transaction costs actually exist? The answer, and this is another of Ronald Coase's insights, is to make your best estimate of who the least cost avoider is. That is, the person who will incur the least cost to avoid the harm under consideration. If you can correctly identify that person or entity and allocate the liability there, then you'll minimize transaction costs. Now, identifying this least cost avoider is an empirical problem, and it's often a difficult one. But to see how it works, let's return to our railroad hypothetical. Imagine that the spark arresters cost $100,000 to install. And also imagine that the farmer who is subject to a fire is going to lose, say, $5,000 in profits in his hay cultivation. If 100 farmers are affected, their potential loss is $500,000. In this example, then, Coase would say that liability should be placed with the railroad. In other words, the railroad should pay for the damages. In the Internet of Things, the same thing is probably true. Think back to the Nest thermostat. It is probably more costly for thousands of individuals to protect their data and privacy than it is for Nest to build better protections into its thermostat. And so Coase tells us that in general, we should write legal rules requiring companies like Nest to protect the data. And that also means that individuals need to be willing to pay a small amount of money to the manufacturer to better preserve and not lose or share that information. So then the problem becomes, who sets the rules? Who's responsible for figuring out who this least cost avoider is? To attempt to answer that, it's worth considering the conclusions of an American Bar Association report on security in cyberspace. According to the report, which I participated in, overall, it is likely that cyber technology will continue to develop at a faster pace than cyber policy. Absent corrective action, this will continue to magnify the tragedy of the commons afflicting cyberspace. Now here's the interesting part of the analysis. In the face of that tragedy, and in the absence of effective governmental action, we may see self-help networks develop within the private sector. What are self-help networks? Well, I work with a group that's called I Am the Cavalry. We're law and technology specialists who are convinced that Congress will not arrive in time to protect or regulate data privacy and device security in the Internet of Things. So the cavalry has taken it upon themselves to be the cavalry and to ride to the rescue, in effect, in the Internet of Things. One first step, which shows the value of private action, was to push for voluntary reforms in the car industry. I Am the Cavalry prodded automakers to, for example, separate the radio and car brakes via separate integrated circuits, so that hacking the radio wouldn't allow you to jimmy the brakes. If you've seen the videos of hackers making a Jeep run crazy on the highway, you know that's a real problem. And as this example shows, we might do well to try at least to solve the collective action problem through an expression of pure democracy. Individuals working collectively rather than waiting for the government to act for us. It is still a nearly intractable problem, but the good news is that the Internet makes crowdsourcing, a form of collective action, actually much easier. So the next question we might want to ask, almost as difficult as the last, is what should be the permissible uses for data collected by the Internet of Things? Here are two examples that I think capture the problem quite well. In Barcelona, Spain, the city deployed a parking system developed by a company called World Sensing. The system is known as FastPark. It's a real-time data collection system that gathers information about the availability of local parking and transmits it to the driver who has the FastPark application on his mobile phone device. If you've ever been in a parking lot that makes use of red and green lights to indicate available parking spaces, you know how useful it is to have such help about where parking is available. Even better, in Barcelona, instead of trolling through the parking structure looking for a green light, the information is streamed direct to your mobile phone through the FastPark app. It'll then tell you that there's a spot open on the third floor of a particular lot, or eventually, even that there's a street-level spot open on the next block over. The benefits of FastPark are obvious. It'll reduce congestion in central Barcelona, and in the long run, reduce carbon dioxide emissions, and aid in the fight of global warming. With FastPark, your identity and the time of your parking interaction are immediately shared across the network with the product developer, World Sensing. And in the absence of some restriction, this information is then also shared with their customer, the city of Barcelona. So you've just sent an automated notice to the city of when you personally began parking and where. So now imagine that you've overstayed your allotted time. Perhaps the space specified a 2-hour limit. The FastPark app has a sensor tied to that space and will know exactly how long you've occupied it. We won't even need a meter maid to come by and write you a parking ticket. It can be transmitted direct to your app. Parking efficiency goes up, to be sure, but so does parking enforcement. That one doesn't worry you? Let's consider another one. I've read reports of an effort to develop an intelligent pillbox. This one is called MemoBox, and it's a web-enabled pillbox that will know when you are supposed to take your medication and give you a gentle reminder to do so. It's actually an incredibly sophisticated device with, as described in Giz magazine, a brain, the cloud computing servers to which it's connected, sensors, that is, the hardware in the box that tracks when users open it and take out a pill, and then the intermediate nerve fibers, the wireless technology that seamlessly syncs the box, the application on your phone that provides the reminder, and the cloud servers that make it all work. This smart pillbox is so sophisticated that it even has a double dose alarm. It knows if you've recently opened the memo box and will ask you to check to be sure that you haven't already taken the dose you thought you might need. And the memo box learns your habits. It can make an educated guess if you've opened the pill box by accident. For those of us with elderly parents or relatives with dementia and other conditions that limit the ability to provide self-care, like former military service members with traumatic brain injuries, this intelligent pill box sounds like a godsend. It'll help those with failing mental capacity maintain their medical doses despite their problems. As always, the wonders of the network of things seem almost sublime. Heck, the smart pill boxes I've seen are even available in designer colors: cherry blossom pink, Oxford blue, and silver ivory white. The potential downside is this. What are the consequences if we skip a dose and our smart pill box sends out the alarm? If our doctor is notified, what will he do? What about our health insurer? Do we want to relinquish our capacity to share or withhold that type of information? On the other hand, isn't it reasonable for the doctor and the insurer to want accurate information about whether or not we're taking our medicine regularly? The intrusiveness of the inquiry is palpable, but the justification for keeping our personal failures secret is, well, also troubling. Tools like MemoBox force us to be honest with ourselves and others, and that does make us uncomfortable. Let's turn now for a moment to the Internet of it and those. Data collection that does not directly reveal our activities. At least at first glance, those aspects of the Internet of Things seem decidedly less problematic. But I suspect they may prove equally disruptive, if not more so. Let's say, for example, that your automobile tire tells you that it's low in pressure. What do? Well, you fix it, of course. That's the natural reaction. But do you have a duty to fix it? What if you put it off for a day or two and something bad happens? Without any recorded information of the problem, you are under a general obligation to make sure your car is running well. But you'd never be found negligent for damage caused by a crash that happened because your tire pressure was too low. For the sake of this example, forget that I have the smart tire gauge. You aren't just expected to keep track of your tire pressure on a daily basis. It isn't what the reasonable person would do. Now, how does that change when you start to have perfect knowledge? If your tire tells you that it's low, you might now have an obligation to correct the flaw immediately. And of course, it isn't just tires. Every component in your car will be reporting to you on a minute-by-minute basis. And that, in turn, might make you legally responsible for keeping your car in perfect tip-top shape. Are you sure that's an obligation you want? During an episode of the popular TV show Homeland, the vice president was killed by an attack on his pacemaker. While this produced gripping drama on television, it has since become practical reality. When George W. Bush was president, and in the hospital briefly, the vice president, Dick Cheney, who suffered from well-documented heart problems, went so far as to turn off his pacemaker while he briefly ran the country. Was Dick Cheney thinking about the same sorts of dangers to himself? And the next time you check your thermostat, will you think about it? You might want to really check the thermostat closely.